Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou will begin her extradition hearing in a Vancouver court on Monday, 13 months after she was arrested on a U.S. extradition request. The U.S. says she's wanted for bank fraud and violating Iranian sanctions. For Meng to be extradited, however, the Canadian court must prove she has also broken the law in Canada. So what key arguments will unfold over the next few days, and how does the case fit into the China-U.S. Canada ties? Joining me in the Beijing studio is Professor Jin Haijun, professor at Renmin University of China of the Law School, and from Adelaide, Australia, Lacey, senior lecturer in international trade at the University of Adelaide and former vice president at Huawei Technologies. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So a little bit of background here. First, the U.S. State Department has levied on Meng Wanzhou 13 charges with bank fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud and wire fraud, a violation of U.S. economic sanctions on Iran. So now we're looking at 3 stages of the trial. First stage, which starts on Monday, is about double criminality, meaning whether she has broken any law in Canada. Then in June, if she gets to go to the second stage in June, the court will have to look at if there is any political motivation behind the charges against her, and then possibly on to the third stage, which starts in November, where the Canadian government will be looking at evidence for extraditing her to the United States. According to government data, close to 90% of extradition requests are granted from Canada to the United States, and the final decision will rest on David Lametti, who is Canada's Justice Minister, and both sides can appeal, so the process could take years. Simon, let me go to you first. From your perspective, what will you be watching out for during the first stage of deliberation about double criminality? Whether, how big is the likelihood that she could be in trouble because of, her being found criminal according to Canadian law as well?
Well, I think the standard of double criminality is going to be fairly hard to meet for the prosecution, just because, well, I mean, just over the weekend we had some revelations coming out of Hong Kong. The South China Morning Post revealed that documents that they had seen showed that HSBC was well aware of the relationship between Huawei and SkyTech, the alleged distributor in Iran.
Skycom,
and of course, with HSBC, you're dealing with a very sophisticated international financial services provider, and the idea that HSBC wouldn't know its client and wouldn't be familiar with the dealings between Huawei and SkyTech, it does sound a little bit preposterous. In addition to that, I think they need to demonstrate that HSBC suffered a financial loss in order to meet the standard of fraud under Canadian law, and that again is going to raise the evidentiary burden for the Crown prosecution in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Professor Jing, my question to you is, it seems to be clear to many people that this was a political decision, right? Mm-hmm. President Trump even mentioned several times that if it is helpful to the trade negotiations, he's going to bring in the case against Meng. So clearly to many people this is a political case. But are we looking at this factor yet, or are we looking at purely the legal aspect of this whole thing?
Okay, apparently it's a legal case. So we needed to learn more about the Canadian law, especially extradition law. But as you said, the United States, why in this time? Why Ms. Meng Wanzhou, CFO of Huawei company? So there's a mixture of the legal issues and the political issues. But I want to emphasize that we needed to, look into the legal issues firstly.
But again, this whole thing is unprecedented, right? I mean, the kind of efforts to incriminate a business executive on such charges instead of pressing any penalties or huge sums of fines. Let's say what the United States is asking for is basically a life behind bars as a way to punish Meng Wanzhou. How do you look at that, Simon, from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, what's being undertaken against the CFO of Huawei is completely unprecedented, really. I mean, you have a whole range of companies, I mean, real household names in American corporate landscape that have been fined for breaching U.S. sanctions, whether it be against, in Cuba or Sudan or Iran, and at no point did any of those executives face the prospect of spending time behind jail. So really to up the ante now and in such a high-profile manner, it just cries after some sort of political posturing or trying to gain some sort of geopolitical advantage in the ongoing sort of trade tensions between the U.S. and China.
Professor Jin, how do you look at the fate of Meng Wanzhou here? Obviously, she has made the unwise decision of stopping over in Canada at that particular moment. Not knowing the potential risks that's waiting her potentially at that border check. So how do you look at the fate she is looking at this moment, being held not just for what she did on an economic or corporate perspective, but also being caught in the geopolitical games between the big country of China and the United States, and also with Canada caught in between?
From this point, I want to say Meng Wanzhou looks like the victim of this geopolitical game. And especially Huawei has been the target of United States wants to sanction against, especially 5G technology and other emerging technology which Huawei compete with U.S. companies and others. So for the matter of Mrs. Meng, I think that it's in the legal process, extradition process. So that's according to Canada law, it's in the phase 2. Totally, there are 3 phases during this process. So the judicial can be, I guess, it can be a long period to decide. If the final result, that means no guilty, it not meet the double criminality standard, that's everything is fine. But if even we think that the worst result, if found guilty, there will be more procedure in the next stage.
Right, so she potentially could face a very prolonged period of time of a legal battle against her people who are sorting after her. But Simon, how do you look at the difficulty faced with the Canadian government and the Canadian court who is handling this case at this moment? Do you think they will be able to do a job, an independent, non-political job, and strictly upholding the rule of law as they claim they do in Canada?
Look, I think the Canadian criminal justice process will do a fairly good job of examining the evidence in an unbiased manner and coming to a verdict. I think what you mentioned at the beginning of this segment was that ultimately it will come down to a political decision by the Minister of Justice to extradite. And there the onus will really be on the Minister to decide whether he, or depending on how far down the track this is going to go, if she views that all procedural fairness has been observed, and also whether there are humanitarian grounds not to extradite, but also the completely unprecedented nature of an extradition request by the U.S. in what is essentially an alleged case of corporate malfeasance. Right? I think the onus is really going to be on the Minister of Justice to weigh the national interest here on whether or not to extradite.
Well, I think that would be a very unfortunate situation to go to, because clearly Canada has a very strong interest to keep a very good relationship with the United States, which is its next door neighbor, right? With China, although the trade is very substantial, still it's not as big compared to Canada's trade, for instance, with the United States. Professor Jin.
Look,
How
I
do you
think,
look at the challenge?
I
Yeah.
think
Okay,
the,
Simon.
the
Yeah.
thing that the political leadership, I think that the factor that the political leadership of Canada needs to keep a clear focus on is that the countries don't have friends, countries have interests. And right now, Canada needs to do a very sort of cold assessment of what its interests in this case are. For now, you've seen Canada really being the fall guy for the U.S. and its relationship with China having suffered enormously poor consequences, while its number one trading partner, the U.S., is cutting a deal with its number two trading partner, China, which does absolutely nothing to further Canada's interests. In fact, only risks diminishing the market access that Canadian companies now have in China. So I think the Canadian political leadership needs to do a clear-eyed assessment of what its interests are in this case.
Professor Jin, how do you look at the correlation between the trade process, the trade negotiations between China and the United States on this case? Now that they have inked the Phase 1 deal, will the fate of Meng Wanzhou be affected in any way?
Yes, as we know that Phase 1 trade deal between U.S. and China now has been signed. That's a very good news for both countries and for the world, including China, including Canada. But one important thing we needed to notice that Meng Wanzhou is just, not obviously the one part for this trade deal. But be honest, almost everyone will, think there's kind of relationship between Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, and U.S. China trade negotiation. So
because the U.S. want to kill this company. Right?
Yeah, looks like that. But I don't want to say like this way because in the relationship between U.S. and China, it's a high level. China has to concede something more important than just one company. But we have to say the citizen like Chinese citizen like Meng Wanzhou and a Chinese company like Huawei is just one part of Chinese interest.
Okay.
So the country needed to protect them as well,
As
not
well
just
as
the
overall,
national interest.
Yeah, as well as the overall
Yeah.
economic and developmental rights of China. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Jin Haijun from Renmin University of China and Simon Lacey, Senior Lecturer in International Trade at the University of Adelaide, also former Vice President at Huawei Technologies. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LA. Thanks for watching. You've got the